we are going to be diving into a message this morning that I've titled Cultural or Credible. And Easter to me is kind of this fascinating holiday because we're talking about a holiday that culturally kind of represents eggs and baskets, right? But it's also kind of sandwiched between this reality of this is a cultural holiday on the church calendar that we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, this moment in human history. Now, as a pastor, I think it's easy to get kind of typecasted as the religious guy, right? But I got to be honest, I got nothing wrong with the fun of Easter. You know what I'm saying? When that 1991 Cadbury Cream Egg commercial re-airs every year, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's the presence of God coming into my living room. Because that thing, I mean, how many else, that weird commercial that, you know what I mean? They continue just to air it and with the weird animal noises. Like, for me, I'm like, come on, like that is the presence of God. And I truly believe that, like springtime, and like sometimes these things are like the manifestation of spring and how that represents God's beauty. And I love that kind of stuff. And so I think for me, there's this cultural kind of reality, and then there's this like event in human history that we're talking about. But I'm not here to like push against candy or like fun, right? Because I gotta be honest, I love that stuff. And I don't think pastels are like really what's threatening to the power of Easter this morning. You know what I'm saying? I think the real tension isn't eggs, but it's credibility. And I believe that the real culprit would be somebody that I call all caps guy. Anybody know this guy? All caps guy? You know, that person who communicates truth in all caps. He's got a lot of opinions and likes to spread them with a lot of all caps type of zeal. So when it comes to Easter, all caps guy might be like this up on the screen. Easter is not about the eggs, it's about the empty tomb, right? Maybe all caps guy might say it's not about the candy, it's about the Christ. All caps guy, Jesus is risen, not the rabbit. Now, once again, I appreciate zeal when I see it, but a zeal for truth can so often lose something powerful called grace, nuance, real life reflection. So what's the real collateral of this type of behavior? In kind of preparation for this morning, going down the rabbit holes, like studying and everything, I revisited an interesting character who actually admired Jesus deeply, but he never joined kind of the movement, so to speak, of being a Jesus follower. And this person I'm talking about is Mahatma Gandhi, who helped lead India out of British rule in 1947. But he was a practicing Hindu, and he found the value in other faiths, such as Christianity. And so he's been attributed to saying this kind of paraphrase sentiment, which, there's like 50 versions of this quote, really. So I'll just put like the paraphrase version of this. You might have heard this before. This is something that Gandhi said, which was something to the effect of, I liked your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. And many historians say that literally Gandhi would meditate on the teachings of Jesus daily. But he's still never really associated with a community of people who identified as Christians. Why? Might be the question. And there's a lot of things that happened in Gandhi's life, but he had a lot of experiences with these communities of faith. And there was a few key moments a lot of people point to in his life of why he never associated with a community of faith and the people of Jesus. During this time, the British Empire claimed to be Christian, and he watched them oppress and exploit people. He watched Christian missionaries come and look down on other Indian religions and try to convert people through methods of fear and force. And maybe most of all, when he experienced racial discrimination firsthand from white Christians in South Africa who rejected him from entering into a church building based on the way that he looked. Assuming, aggressive, off-putting. Sounds a lot like all caps guy a little bit, right? A version of Christianity that feels loud, feels political, feels judgmental, feels unthoughtful, or it goes without being said, feels not like Jesus. And sadly, it's like, that's not ancient history, right? It still happens in different forms today. And so maybe one of the biggest threats to the power of Easter isn't like a bunny suit, right? We got Jumpman Jordan bunny on the Easter logo this year. I love that. So maybe it's not that's causing Easter to lose its, so to speak, credibility, but maybe it's a version of Christianity that's lost its credibility. What if the resurrection as an event isn't rejected because it's unbelievable, but because it's made unbelievable in the way that we might live, speak, and represent Jesus? It's interesting because Gandhi didn't reject Jesus. He actually admired him deeply. He reflected arguably on the scriptures more often than people that claim to follow Jesus. But Gandhi had trouble with Christians. And maybe that's not just his story, but maybe that's a part of our cultural story. Maybe that's a part of 2025 and what makes Easter maybe so complicated for us as people. We don't know what to do with the Jesus we like because of people we've come to distrust. So today I want to make a suggestion, something bold but simple, essentially. Let's recover the credibility of Easter a little bit. And here's kind of the big idea that we're going to really spend the next several moments kind of wrestling with, and it'll be up on the screen, and it's that Easter becomes most credible when the resurrection of Jesus is reflected in real life. Easter becomes most credible when the resurrection of Jesus is reflected in real life. I'm fascinated by prayers that Jesus made, like, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." This overlap of a spiritual reality and a human reality as well. Easter's credible, not by yelling louder, right? Not by weaponizing the Bible, and definitely, in my personal opinion, not by advocating for less candy and Cadbury eggs. Come on, somebody. But I think we can return to the actual credible foundation of the Christian faith through the resurrection of Jesus. And I believe the heart of Jesus is something solid, historic, personal, hopeful. And we've got to start with a resurrection that we believe still matters and has to do with real life. I like how Paul, one of the early church leaders, he wrote about this very idea. So there's a sense of timelessness as one of these early church leaders. He wrote these words in a letter to some of these early churches a couple thousand years ago in the first century. He says this in 1 Corinthians 15, "If there's no resurrection, there's no living Christ. And face it, if there's no resurrection for Christ, everything we've told you is smoke and mirrors, and everything you've staked your life on is smoke and mirrors. Not only that, but we would be guilty of telling a string of barefaced lies about God. All these affidavits that we passed on to you, verifying that God raised up Christ, sheer fabrications, if there's no resurrection." Easter can't be smoke and mirrors, right? Or else we're kind of all wasting our time this morning. So we're going to walk through 3 ways that I believe we can recover Easter's credibility in real life. And so the first thing I want to talk about is a credible source in real life. Briefly talking about where does this event of the resurrection even come from, right? And it comes from a source, the Bible. Specifically, the back 1/3 of the Bible, known as the New Testament, the Christian Bible. And so up on the screen we have a chart, and I've used this over the years, and this year specifically kind of updated some of the newest archaeological findings and dates and carbon dating. So what we have up on the screen is a chart just to show kind of some of the major key pieces in literature that we oftentimes relate to as truth, as just reliable, right? And so as an example, Homer, who's the Greek poet of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the earliest copies by carbon dating that we have removed from the original is about 400 years, and we have about 1,800 plus copies. I mean, quite a bit. This is a pretty profound reliability around the writings of Homer. Plato A famous philosopher, right? We have about 1,200 years carbon dating removed from the original copies, and about 200 plus. Aristotle, another famous philosopher, about 1,100 years removed from the earliest, or the original copy by carbon dating, about 50 plus. Julius Caesar of Rome, another one. Many of the writings, you study literature, you definitely will study these writings, right? About 900 years removed from the earliest copies, about 20 plus number of copies that we have. Tacitus, the Greek historian, about 750 years removed from the original. 30 plus copies. And then we get to the New Testament, really the source of the events of the resurrection of Jesus, and around 30 to 300 years. So many within a lifetime we have removed of when Jesus lived through carbon dating, and we have around 5,800 number of copies in the Greek, the original language of the New Testament. And then we have 20,000 plus, that includes Latin, Syriac, Coptic languages, right? So I don't know about you, just as like kind of just like reality check, the credible source of the resurrection, a real life source, that restores credibility for Easter for me, reminding myself, like, this isn't something that we're just basing off of, reading about, that's based on a source that is unreliable, but as we see in conjunction or in comparison with other pieces of literature, that we oftentimes consider and receive as truth, the New Testament is a very reliable and credible source. And Easter becomes most credible, I believe, when the resurrection of Jesus is actually reflected in real life, real research, real study, real science, right? And so next I want to walk through how we can recover Easter's credibility through what we could say is a credible event in real life. So we had a credible source and a credible event. I think this is important. Now, up on the screen will be a few recommended resources, because we're going to look at kind of the circumstances around this event happening in human history, the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus died and he rose again. He resurrected from death, right? Claimed to be God himself. And so I'd say like a good medium, kind of like, or small, medium, and large resource. If you're like interested, like me, I'm a big like researcher. There's 3 resources I would recommend. We're not going to get to like all the data in this. I want to hit a few touch points. So if you want to do some like extra reading, I'd say there's 3 great resources: small, medium, large. Small being the Case for Easter by a guy named Lee Strobel. It takes a very journalistic approach to the circumstances surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. A good medium, like 240-page resource would be The Bedrock of Christianity by Justin W. Bass. Takes a little bit of a deeper dive. And then for all my theologians out there, we got the 740-page masterpiece by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God. Brilliant work that N.T. Wright has dedicated, and so if you want to take a deep dive, there's your recommendation. But let's like I said, we're not going to be able to get to all this. There could be some addendum reading maybe after this, but I want to just do a little quick flyover about this being a credible event, and first start off with some kind of circumstantial evidence, so to speak, that'll be up on the screen. A quick flyover. One being that Jesus' disciples, his followers, were transformed. We read about them being these very timid and fearful people that end up dying for him. Jesus' disciples remained loyal to Jesus as their victorious Messiah. People often say a failed Messiah is a forgotten Messiah, but Jesus did what he promised to do, as the disciples remained loyal to him as a person who made those promises. The disciples had exemplary character. They were known as these devout Jews in the first century who gave their life for others, cared for widows and orphans, and helped the needy. Another piece of circumstantial evidence is worship literally changed within the Jewish tradition. The early church stopped worshiping on Saturday like Jews and worshiped on Sundays in memory of Jesus' Sunday resurrection, often like we do today, and often practiced sacraments like communion and baptism, which represent the work of what Jesus had done. Another key circumstantial piece of evidence is women discovered the tomb. And during this time, women in the first century did not have many rights. So questioning and coercing women for truth was extremely easy because of the threat of their practical well-being. and their low status that they carried in the social pecking order of the day. The entirety of the early church preaching was centered on the historical fact of Jesus' resurrection. It's interesting, like, the writings of the early church don't make a case of, like, how this happened, but really it's more of a case of why it happened and how it applies to people's faith during that time and their dedication to God. Another piece would be Jesus' tomb was not enshrined. It's interesting because every religion, including Judaism, made a big deal about the tomb where the person's bones was laid, but there were no bones to verify in Jesus' case. And then last but not least, as Christianity exploded on the earth and a few billion people today claim to be Christians, there was a man crucified. Jesus' death, he was crucified on a cross. There was a man to his left that was crucified, a man to his right that was crucified, and they did not start a movement or are currently today worshipped as God. So it's interesting. Some pieces of circumstantial evidence that I think is interesting for us to look at. I think also it's helpful to kind of look at, when it comes to this event being credible, the historical evidence during the time and during that first century. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, lived during that first century. In an excerpt from his most celebrated passage called the Testimonium Flavianum, it says this: "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. When Pilate had condemned him to be crucified, those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive." Suetonius, who was a Roman historian, lived during that first century. In his biography of the Roman Emperor Nero, talked about the punishment of Christians. Said the punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition, which many scholars point to, that's likely referring to this event, the resurrection. Pliny the Younger, a lawyer, an author, and a magistrate of ancient Rome, in a letter to the Emperor Trajan around AD 111, he said Christians were in the habit of meeting on a fixed day before dawn and singing responsibly a hymn to Christ as to a God. And once again, many scholars believe that's referring to Sunday as this fixed and new day of remembrance of Jesus' resurrection. And then lastly, I think it's helpful to note that historic Jewish explanation does not deny the tomb being empty when they disagree. They just disagree on what the tomb being empty meant. And so they would argue that the body was stolen rather than resurrected. Which means all the guards that were on the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' resurrection who were guarding the tomb would have had to fall asleep at the same time. The enormous stone that blocked Jesus' tomb would have had to be moved without any of the guards waking up. And once again, a contradiction to the multiple eyewitness accounts and testimonies that pointed to Jesus walking around in resurrected form after his death. Now, lastly, I think it's good for us to revisit the New Testament. As we talked about a credible source, I think this event is recorded in the New Testament as a credible source, right? And I think it's good to be reminded there's eyewitness accounts of Jesus being executed, dying, right? In the Gospel of John, we read about this in John 19. His eyewitness account says, one of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. I love this note in verse 35. This report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you also may continue to believe. I love that pleading of going, this happened. This was an event that we can rely upon and look to. And then not only Jesus died, but the centerpiece of Easter. And this morning, Jesus resurrected. In Luke's eyewitness account, I love this account. In Luke 24, it says, and just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. So these are his earliest followers, and Jesus shows up in resurrected form. Peace be with you, he said. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. Why are you frightened, he asked? Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I'm not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies, as you see that I do. As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. Still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Then he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. I love this. Resurrected Jesus eating the meal. I oftentimes think about the meal we're going to eat in the new heavens and the new earth and the future to come. Come on. What is heaven like? Well, Jesus gives us a taste in a resurrected, glorified form. And I don't know about you, but as I think about this event and the credibility of this event, it restores credibility when I realize that this event actually happened in real life. We can point to circumstantial evidence, historical evidence. We can point to reliable sources. And I think Easter becomes most credible when the resurrection of Jesus is reflected in real life. And lastly, I want to kind of end our time together by ending on this idea of credible relationship in real life. A credible relationship in real life. I think it's really interesting that the resurrection of Jesus is this big framing of power. That Jesus overcame death because of the power and the nature and the character of God. That this is this moment of death being defeated, so to speak, in the eyewitness account of what actually happened and how powerful God truly is. But I think the application of that idea, and I'm going to speak for myself and my experience with Jesus kind of in my own life, is my experience of Jesus' power is kind of interesting when you regard power in such a massive and big way, in the ways that oftentimes in our kind of human comprehension, we frame this idea of power. And what do I mean by that? Well, I first mean by that, like, in my experience of Jesus, in my relationship with Jesus, which only I can kind of speak for, I would say this, is that he, ironically, in the power of the resurrected Jesus, he meets us in the downs, not just the ups. What I've learned about the resurrected Jesus is he shows up in life's aches and pains. And he creates these opportunities for God to be experienced in the most unexpected places. And I don't know about you, but that feels like real life. Callie and I were talking this weekend, and many of you know that Callie's a therapist and has kind of that adjacent qualification within psychology. And within psychology, oftentimes a lot of psychologists have said that 80% of life, you're not experiencing feelings of happiness. That's life. And I love that God in real relationship, he doesn't try to just joy everything up. But what I've experienced with Jesus is he meets us in that 80%. Yes, he meets us in the 20%, but he meets us in the real life that takes the totality, the holistic experience of what it means to be human in life. Gotta be honest, after having a past relationship with this church, I came and showed up here in about 2007, moved from Tucson, Arizona. I was doing my undergrad there, moved here, scared out of my mind, didn't come from a ministry family, so to speak, and felt God was calling me to vocational ministry. This was the church that I began attending in that season where I was like, what am I doing? I don't have really a model to follow. None of my parents were pastors. And Callie and I became long story short, we became the lead pastors of this church in 2021. A long history of this church, a lot of relationships. And I've never experienced more pain regarding the loss of relationships than in this season. I got to be honest. It's easy to be like, oh, I don't want to tell that side of the story. Because like, well, I could just joy this up for you. But I just want to talk my human impulse to that experience of losing relationships in this season, becoming the pastors of this church. My human impulse was to detach. Don't trust church people. I've experienced so much pain and the loss. Why would I trust? And this is where Jesus has met me, the resurrected Jesus. I believe this. In this season that's felt a lot of down, there's been this beautiful healing as I've learned to trust Jesus in the risk of relationship and community. As the Spirit of Jesus, as the Holy Spirit has leaned in and always said, lean in, be courageous when it feels like you don't want to, detach. And in that trust, I've experienced a deep sense of healing in this season, arguably from the same category of people where that hurt had come from in the first place. That's the faithfulness of Jesus. I think another thing that's interesting about the power of the resurrected Jesus is that he shows up in the small, not just the spectacular, right? What I've learned about the resurrected Jesus is he shows up in the mundane moments, not just the adrenaline-inducing crowd moments. I don't know about you, but that feels real to me. It feels like real life. It feels like the moments that are populated in our life and our days, that are washing dishes, changing diapers, right? Commuting to work. The faith that we get to apply on Monday when we realize that life is filled with way more of those moments. And I think the power of Jesus is powerful because holistically, once again, the resurrected Jesus, he meets us there. He's not trying to get out of that. And that's powerful in and of itself. And I think lastly would be this idea is that he transforms us using the ins, not the outs. What do I mean by that? You know, I've learned you can't really control all caps guy. Whoever that guy is, whatever that person represents in our culture, whatever the frustration that comes along with people behaving badly, even on behalf of Jesus, is you can't control those people. But it's interesting because Jesus never promises to transform those people in our lives. But what he's making a promise for is where it begins. He promises to transform us in taking the responsibility of what it means to be human and flourish as a human being in his vision. We could take responsibility on who we choose to receive from in this life. We can't always fix the world out there, but we literally can let Jesus start in here. And it's interesting how a window oftentimes becomes a mirror. And you realize all caps guy might be in this heart as well. All caps guy might exist when my tone and my aggression increases in the way I speak to my children. Or use any other example in our day-to-day, where life oftentimes reflects, and from a window it turns into a mirror. But that's where Jesus promises to meet us in actual relationship. So I don't know about you, but for me, this real life relationship has restored credibility when it comes to Easter. It's something so much beyond this distant event in human history, but this kind of invitation into the life of what the resurrection of Jesus means today and to all of us and the opportunity we have. The resurrection, it's not just credible in history, but I think it's meant to be experienced in real life. I really do. Through the hard and painful, through the invitation to receive Jesus personally in our everyday lives. So we're going to take a moment to engage with the resurrected Jesus. And I think it's so fitting. You know, one of our traditions on Sunday is to spend time reflecting, and we put a couple questions up on the screen doing that. And I think this is us just saying as a church family of going like, yeah, Jesus is the head of his church, this local church. And he's here, he's among us. He's moving. His Holy Spirit is accessible to guide us, to help us, for us to lean on him when we've reached the end of ourselves. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. In the spirit of Easter, the resurrected Jesus, we're going to just take a moment to reflect and open ourselves up to receive from that Jesus, who I believe is moving. And this room is accessible for each and every one of us personally. And And so the questions that'll be up on the screen are this: what is the Holy Spirit prompting you with today? What are you going to do about it? What was he speaking to you during that message? And what are you going to do about it? And sometimes we frame this in kind of like I will statements, like I will. And so maybe for you, that's I'm going to re-engage my faith with curiosity rather than cynicism. Yeah, I relate to that. I will forgive someone maybe I've written off. I will receive Jesus for real, not just as an idea, but an actual real presence in my life. Maybe I'll open my Bible again for the first time in a long time, or ever. I'll ask Jesus to help show up in the middle of my stress. There's so many ways that it could be expressed, but I know that Jesus is personal enough, and the resurrected Jesus is personal enough in relationship to be faithful to whatever that moment looks like for you this morning and today. So I'm going to pray us into that moment, and we're going to spend some time in reflection, and then Callie's going to come up here and close us this morning. But let's pray together as we enter into that moment. Lord Jesus, we're just thankful that the resurrection finds